I've lived in this quiet neighborhood in Charleston, South Carolina for nearly 20 years now, and if there's one thing I've learned, it's that walls are thinner than people think. My name is Margaret Chen, 50 years old, a retired librarian with too much time on my hands and a front porch that faces the Sullivan family's home. Their house is a pale yellow two-story with white shutters, the kind that looks peaceful from the outside but hides the kind of family drama that could fill a dozen novels. That particular Saturday afternoon in late September, the air was thick with humidity and the scent of magnolias, and I was watering my gardenias when I first noticed the unusual activity next door. Cars had been pulling up to the Sullivans' driveway since morning, and by noon, their lawn was filled with balloons, tables draped in cream-colored linens, and a catering van parked awkwardly near the mailbox. It was clearly a celebration of some kind, though no one had mentioned anything to me during our usual morning waves. I could see Eleanor Sullivan, my neighbor of 15 years, directing traffic in her floral dress, her silver hair pulled back in an elegant bun. She was 68, a woman who carried herself with the kind of grace that came from years of teaching piano to neighborhood children, though she'd retired 5 years ago after her arthritis made it too painful to play. What struck me most was seeing Walter, Eleanor's husband, sitting alone on a folding chair near the back of the yard, away from all the commotion. He was 72, a tall man who had once been a construction foreman but now moved slowly, his broad shoulders slightly hunched. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the lawn, and I could see him watching the preparations with an expression I couldn't quite read from my distance. It wasn't joy exactly, more like quiet observation, the way someone might watch a movie they've already seen. Eleanor kept glancing his way, but she was too busy directing the caterers to actually go speak with him. Then I saw him arrive, Marcus Henderson, Eleanor's son-in-law, stepping out of a sleek black BMW with his wife Claire, the Sullivans' only daughter. Marcus was in his early 30s, dressed in expensive casual wear that screamed money, his dark hair perfectly styled, his smile wide and white. Claire, 32, looked beautiful but tired, her blonde hair falling in waves around her shoulders, her sundress clearly designer. They had a son, little Tommy, who was 7, and immediately ran toward the bounce house that had been set up near the garage. I'd seen Marcus at family gatherings before, always on his phone, always seeming slightly above it all, and I'd never particularly warmed to him. The party was supposedly for Claire's birthday, though. It seemed unusually elaborate. As I pretended to tend my roses, I watched the family greet each other with hugs and laughter, though I noticed Walter remained in his chair, receiving only a quick wave from Claire and a dismissive nod from Marcus. The caterers began setting out trays of food, shrimp cocktail, and fancy knits, the kind of spread that must have cost thousands. More guests arrived, friends and extended family I'd seen over the years, and the yard filled with conversation and music from speakers someone had set up. The whole scene looked picture-perfect, like something from a lifestyle magazine. But there was something off about it that I couldn't quite name. As the afternoon wore on and the sun began its descent, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, I decided to bring over a pie I'd baked that morning, using it as an excuse to satisfy my curiosity. I crossed the small stretch of lawn between our properties, carrying the apple pie covered in foil, and approached the gathering with a friendly smile. Eleanor spotted me immediately and rushed over, her face flushed from the heat and excitement, thanking me profusely for the thoughtful gesture and insisting I stay for a drink. That's when I started to piece together what this celebration was really about, and why the atmosphere felt so strangely tense beneath all the manufactured joy. Eleanor pulled me aside near the beverage table, her voice low despite the festive music playing in the background, and explained that the party was indeed for Claire's birthday, but also served as a sort of family reunion since several relatives had traveled from Atlanta and Savannah. She seemed anxious, her fingers fidgeting with the pearl necklace at her throat, and I could tell there was more she wanted to say but couldn't, not with so many guests around. I noticed her eyes kept darting toward Walter, who remained in his solitary chair, a plate of untouched food balanced on his lap. The September heat hadn't relented even as evening approached, and I could see sweat beading on Eleanor's upper lip, despite the shade from the large oak tree. Marcus was holding court near the grill, surrounded by several younger men who seemed to hang on his every word, and I caught snippets of his conversation about investment portfolios and vacation properties. His voice carried that particular tone of someone who needs everyone to know how successful they are, loud enough to be overheard but casual enough to seem unintentional. Claire was with a group of women near the dessert table, and while she smiled and laughed at appropriate moments, I noticed how her gaze kept wandering to her father, concern evident in the furrow of her brow. Little Tommy was having the time of his life in the bounce house with other children, his laughter cutting through the adult conversations. I excused myself from Eleanor and made my way toward Walter, feeling an inexplicable pull to check on him. As I approached, I could see his weathered face more clearly, the deep lines around his eyes and mouth that spoke of years of hard work and harder decisions. He looked up as I neared, and his blue eyes lit up with recognition and genuine warmth. We'd talked many times over the years, mostly about gardening and the changing neighborhood, and I'd always found him to be kind and unpretentious, the sort of man who listened more than he spoke. He gestured to an empty chair beside him, and I sat down, both of us now spectators to the celebration unfolding before us. "Quite a party," I said, watching the caterers refill champagne glasses while a photographer moved through the crowd snapping pictures. Walter nodded slowly, a slight smile playing at his lips that didn't quite reach his eyes. He told me it was important to Claire, this gathering, and that Eleanor had been planning it for weeks, wanting everything to be perfect for their daughter's 32nd birthday. But there was something in the way he said it, a resignation in his tone, that made me suspect this party meant more to everyone else than it did to him. The breeze picked up slightly, rustling the balloon strings and carrying the scent of grilled meat and expensive perfume across the yard. As we sat there, I watched Marcus separate from his group and approach the bar area, his phone pressed to his ear despite being at a family celebration. He ended his call and grabbed a beer, then scanned the yard with an expression that struck me as evaluative, as if he were appraising everything and everyone around him. His eyes passed over Walter without any particular acknowledgement, and I felt a flash of irritation at the casual dismissal. Walter seemed not to notice, or perhaps he'd grown accustomed to it, and he turned his attention to watching Tommy and the other children play, his expression softening in a way that suggested that watching his grandson was the only part of this party that brought him any real joy. Eleanor appeared suddenly, slightly breathless, and asked Walter if he needed anything, if he was comfortable, if he'd eaten enough. Her concern seemed genuine but also tinged with something else, a nervousness that made me wonder what was really going on in this family. Walter assured her he was fine, patting her hand gently, and she hurried off to attend to something else, leaving us once again in our quiet corner of observation. As the sun continued its descent and the party lights began to glow more brightly, I had the distinct feeling that I was watching the calm before a storm, though I couldn't have explained why. Something about the way this family moved around each other, like planets in careful orbit, suggested that their gravitational balance was more fragile than it appeared. The party reached its peak energy as dusk settled over Charleston, the sky turning deep purple and the strings of lights overhead creating a warm, intimate glow across the yard. A DJ had started playing music, and some guests were dancing on the makeshift dance floor someone had laid out on the grass, while others clustered around tables, their laughter growing louder with each round of drinks. I'd moved from my seat next to Walter to help Eleanor in the kitchen, carrying in empty platters and making small talk with relatives I was meeting for the first time. The house interior was beautifully decorated, photos of Claire throughout her life covering the walls, from childhood ballet recitals to her college graduation to her wedding day. Through the kitchen window, I could see Marcus had finally approached Walter, and they appeared to be having a conversation, though Marcus's body language suggested impatience. His weight shifted to one leg, his arms crossed. Claire had joined them, standing between the two men, and even from a distance I could read the tension in her posture. Eleanor noticed too, her hands stilling on the platter she was washing, water dripping onto the counter as she watched through the window with an expression of worry. She didn't say anything, but I saw her jaw tighten and she turned back to the sink with more force than necessary, the dishes clattering loudly. I decided to step outside for some air, the kitchen having grown warm from all the activity and the constantly opening door. As I made my way through the crowd, accepting compliments on my pie from people I didn't know, I noticed that Walter was alone again, though now he'd moved closer to the house, standing near the doorway that led from the patio into the living room. His expression had changed, become more closed off, and he was holding his beer with both hands as if it were anchoring him. The music shifted to something slower, and several couples moved onto the dance floor, including Claire and Marcus, though their movements seemed mechanical, lacking the warmth you'd expect from a married couple. That's when it happened, the moment that would set everything else into motion. I had stepped into the doorway to set down some empty glasses on the hall table when I heard Marcus's voice, low but clear, coming from just around the corner where he must have ducked away from the party. He was talking to someone, probably on his phone again, his tone dripping with condescension and irritation. The words cut through the evening air like a knife. "That old man stinks," he muttered, followed by a dismissive laugh and then something about how he was tired of pretending to care about these people and their pathetic little celebration. My breath caught in my throat, and I froze, the glasses still clutched in my hands. I could see Walter standing not 15 feet away, his back to Marcus, and I knew with absolute certainty that he had heard every word. His shoulders had stiffened, his head had lowered slightly, and even in the dim light I could see the way his hands tightened around his beer bottle. The noise of the party continued around us, music and laughter and the sound of children playing. But in that moment it all felt very far away, as if Walter and I existed in a bubble of terrible clarity. Marcus finished his call and walked past Walter without a glance, heading back toward the bar, completely unaware that his words had been overheard. I wanted to go to Walter to say something comforting, but my feet felt rooted to the spot. Instead, I watched as he set down his beer, straightened his shoulders, and walked quietly into the house, disappearing into the interior rooms away from the party. Eleanor must have seen him go because she emerged from the kitchen. Her face creased with concern and followed him inside. The party continued its cheerful chaos outside, but I couldn't shake the image of Walter's face, the hurt and resignation I'd seen there, and I felt a burning anger toward Marcus Henderson that surprised me with its intensity. I didn't know Walter well enough to call him a close friend, but I knew enough to recognize a good man when I saw one. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of forced normalcy. Claire cut her elaborate birthday cake while everyone sang and cameras flashed. But I noticed she kept looking toward the house, clearly aware that something had happened. Marcus played the doting husband, his arm around Claire's waist, his smile bright in public, and no one else seemed to notice the hollowness of it all. As guests began to leave, thanking the hosts and complimenting the beautiful party, I caught Eleanor's eye across the yard, and she gave me a small, sad smile that confirmed she knew something had shifted tonight, though perhaps not the full extent of what I'd witnessed in that doorway. The next morning arrived with that particular quality of light that only September in Charleston can produce. Golden and slightly hazy, promising heat, but not yet delivering it. I was on my porch with my coffee at 7 a.m., a habit I'd maintained since retirement, watching the neighborhood slowly wake up. The Sullivan house was quiet, their yard still showing evidence of the party. Crumpled napkins caught in the bushes, a few forgotten balloons sagging against the fence. I expected to see Eleanor out early collecting the debris, as she was usually meticulous about such things, but the house remained still and closed up, blinds drawn against the morning sun. Around 9, I saw Claire's BMW pull into the driveway and she emerged alone. Without Marcus or Tommy, her hair pulled back in a messy ponytail and wearing yoga pants and an oversized sweatshirt, despite the warming temperature. She knocked on her parents' door and waited, shifting her weight from foot to foot in a way that suggested anxiety. And when Eleanor finally answered, the two women embraced for a long moment on the doorstep before disappearing inside. I felt guilty for watching so closely, but my concern for Walter after what I'd witnessed the previous night overrode my usual respect for privacy. Something was unfolding in that house, and I suspected it had everything to do with Marcus's cruel words. About an hour later, I was weeding my front garden when Eleanor came out and walked purposefully toward my property. Her face looked drawn as if she hadn't slept, and her usually impeccable appearance was disheveled, her shirt misbuttoned and her hair hastily pinned. She apologized for bothering me, but asked if we could talk, and I immediately invited her inside, settling her at my kitchen table with a fresh cup of coffee and some banana bread I'd made the day before. She sat there for a moment, just holding the warm mug, before the words began pouring out of her in a torrent of frustration and sadness. Walter had barely slept, she told me, and when he did finally talk to her around 3 in the morning, he'd revealed that he'd heard Marcus's comment, heard him call him names and mock the party that Walter himself had paid for in its entirety. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears as she explained that the party, everything from the catering to the DJ to the photographer, had been Walter's gift to Claire. Thousands of dollars that he'd saved carefully over months because he wanted his daughter to have something special. Marcus had no idea, apparently because Claire hadn't told him, wanting to surprise him with how nice everything would be. Never imagining that her husband would respond with such contempt for her father, the revelation hit me like a physical blow, and I felt my anger toward Marcus intensify into something white-hot and righteous. Eleanor continued, her voice breaking as she described how Walter had worked construction for 45 years, often taking extra jobs and overtime to provide for his family, how he'd paid for Claire's entire college education without loans, how he'd given them a substantial down payment for their house as a wedding gift. Marcus knew none of this, or if he did, he'd apparently dismissed it as insufficient, viewing Walter as somehow beneath him, a working-class man unworthy of respect. Eleanor's hands shook as she wiped her eyes, and I reached across the table to squeeze them, feeling helpless in the face of such casual cruelty. What made it worse, Eleanor explained, was that Claire was devastated. She'd apparently confronted Marcus early that morning when she'd noticed something was wrong with her father, and Marcus had initially denied saying anything before finally admitting to it but dismissing it as just venting and no big deal. Claire had left the house with Tommy, dropping their son at her mother-in-law's place before coming to her parents' home, and Eleanor suspected their marriage was in serious trouble. Walter, meanwhile, had retreated into himself, refusing to discuss the matter further and insisting that it didn't matter, that he didn't want to cause problems between Claire and Marcus. But Eleanor could see the hurt in her husband's eyes, the way his shoulders sagged, and she felt powerless to fix it. I sat with Eleanor for over an hour, letting her talk and cry and express all the complicated emotions swirling through her. She felt guilty for not defending Walter more forcefully over the years when Marcus had made smaller, subtler, dismissive comments. She felt angry at Marcus for his disrespect, and at Claire for not being more transparent with her husband about her parents' generosity. She felt protective of Walter and worried about Claire and frustrated with the whole situation. As she finally prepared to leave, thanking me for listening and for my discretion, I made a decision that I knew might be controversial but felt necessary, though I kept it to myself for the moment, not wanting to add to Eleanor's burden. The following days unfolded with an uncomfortable tension that seemed to permeate our quiet street. Claire's car was a constant presence at her parents' house, and on the third day, I saw her bringing suitcases inside, suggesting she'd left Marcus, at least temporarily. Tommy was with her, and I watched the 7-year-old playing in the Sullivan backyard with his grandfather, Walter pushing him on the old tire swing that had hung from the oak tree since Claire was a child. There was something both heartwarming and heartbreaking about the scene. The way Walter smiled at his grandson while carrying such obvious pain, the way Tommy's laughter filled the yard that had been so artificially festive just days before. Marcus appeared on the 4th day, his BMW screeching to a stop in front of the Sullivan house with an aggression that drew attention from several neighbors who happened to be outside. He stormed up to the door, and even from my porch I could hear the raised voices, though I couldn't make out specific words. The confrontation lasted about 20 minutes before Marcus emerged, his face red with anger, and sped off down the street fast enough that Mrs. Patterson from 2 houses down called out in complaint. Claire appeared at the door moments later, her face in her hands, and Eleanor wrapped her arms around her daughter, both women standing there in the doorway in a tableau of shared grief. That evening, I finally acted on the decision I'd been contemplating since Eleanor's visit to my kitchen. I sat down at my computer and opened the neighborhood social media group, a Facebook page that included most of the families on our street and several surrounding blocks. I thought carefully about what I was going to say, knowing that once I posted, there would be no taking it back, and that the consequences might ripple through multiple lives. But the image of Walter's face when he'd heard Marcus's words, the knowledge of his quiet generosity and the cruel dismissal it had received, pushed me forward. I began typing, choosing my words with the precision I'd once used in cataloging library books. My post was straightforward and factual. I explained that I'd witnessed something at a recent party that troubled me deeply, that I'd overheard someone mocking an elderly neighbor who had, unbeknownst to the mocker, paid for the entire celebration out of his own savings. I didn't name names, but I described the situation in enough detail that anyone who'd attended the party or lived on our street would immediately understand who I was talking about. I wrote about respect and gratitude, about how we owe our elders recognition for their sacrifices, and about the ugliness of judging people based on superficial markers of success rather than character. I finished with a call for our community to reflect on how we treat those around us, especially those who give without expecting recognition. The response was immediate and explosive. Within an hour, I had over 50 comments, and the number kept climbing. Some people were shocked, others angry, and several asked for more specific details, which I carefully declined to provide beyond what I'd already said. A few people defended the right to privacy and questioned whether I should have posted at all, but they were drowned out by the majority who expressed support for the elderly neighbor and contempt for the unnamed mocker. The post was shared beyond our immediate neighborhood group, picked up by other local Charleston community pages, and by the next morning, it had been shared nearly 300 times with comments numbering in the hundreds. What I hadn't anticipated was how quickly people would identify Marcus Henderson. Someone who'd attended the party commented that they'd noticed tension and mentioned seeing Marcus on his phone constantly, and another person who apparently knew. Marcus professionally made a veiled comment about entitled investment bankers who think money makes them better than everyone. Within 24 hours of my post, Marcus's name was being openly discussed in the comments. His behavior dissected and condemned, and his professional reputation was beginning to take hits. A former colleague commented about Marcus's general attitude toward working-class people, and someone else shared a story about Marcus's dismissive behavior at a charity event. The pylon was relentless and spreading by the end of the week. The situation had escalated beyond anything I'd imagined when I'd made that initial post. Marcus's firm, a mid-sized investment company with a reputation to protect, had apparently gotten wind of the social media firestorm, and according to Eleanor, who stopped by with updates she'd heard through Claire, Marcus had been called in for a meeting with the senior partners. The issue wasn't just the personal rudeness, though. That was bad enough. But the fact that several clients had seen the posts and comments and were questioning whether they wanted to work with someone who treated people, especially elderly people, with such contempt in the world of wealth management, where trust and relationship building are everything, Marcus's behavior was becoming a liability. Claire had filed for separation, Eleanor told me on that visit, her voice heavy with mixed emotions. She was proud of her daughter for standing up for her father, but worried about Tommy and the upheaval in his young life. Walter remained stoic, insisting that he didn't want to be the cause of his daughter's marriage ending. But Eleanor could see a subtle shift in him, a straightening of his spine that suggested he felt validated in a way he perhaps hadn't before. Marcus had apparently tried to call Claire multiple times, leaving voicemails that ranged from apologetic to angry to pleading, but she wasn't responding. The community support for the Sullivan family had been overwhelming, with neighbors stopping by with food and offers of help, treating Walter with a new level of visible respect. The neighborhood reaction to my post created an interesting social shift on our street. People who had previously treated Walter as just another retiree now made a point of stopping to chat with him, asking about his construction work and listening to his stories with genuine interest. The younger families, in particular, seemed newly aware of the history contained in our neighborhood's older residents, the lives of hard work and sacrifice that had built the very foundations of their comfort. Walter handled the attention with his characteristic grace, neither embracing nor rejecting it, simply continuing to be himself, working in his garden, playing with Tommy, and supporting his daughter through her difficult time. Marcus, on the other hand, became something of a pariah. His car was no longer welcome on our street, and on the one occasion he tried to visit, approaching the Sullivan house on foot, after parking several blocks away, he was confronted by Mr. Kim from across the street, a retired Marine who made it very clear that Marcus's presence was unwanted. The encounter didn't get physical, but the message was received, and Marcus retreated, his face flushed with humiliation. I watched from my window, feeling a complex mix of satisfaction and guilt, wondering if I'd gone too far in my public calling out. Though the memory of Walter's wounded expression kept my regret at bay, the professional consequences for Marcus continued to mount. One of his major clients, a retired school teacher, who'd come into family money and invested it conservatively with Marcus's firm, specifically requested a different advisor after reading about the incident. Others followed, and within 2 weeks of my initial post, Eleanor reported that Marcus had been placed on administrative leave while the firm conducted a review. In an industry built on reputation and relationships, Marcus's casual cruelty toward an elderly man who'd never done anything but showed generosity to his family had proven to be a career-killing mistake. The irony wasn't lost on anyone that a man who'd mocked someone for stinking had managed to destroy his own standing in the community, with just a few thoughtless words. As September gave way to October, the leaves on the oak tree in the Sullivan yard began to turn, splashes of gold and red against the still green backdrop. Claire had officially moved back into her childhood bedroom with Tommy, and the house had taken on a new energy. 3 generations under one roof, navigating the complicated dynamics of family. I watched Walter teaching Tommy how to rake leaves into piles for jumping, the boy's delighted shrieks carrying across to my porch, and I felt that, perhaps, in the midst of all the pain and disruption, something good was emerging, a reaffirmation of what really mattered, family and respect, and the quiet dignity of a life well lived. The legal proceedings began in mid-October, and the neighborhood watched with varying degrees of interest and judgment as Claire filed formally for divorce. Eleanor confided in me during one of our now regular coffee sessions at my kitchen table that Claire had really tried, to see if there was any way to salvage her marriage. She'd agreed to meet Marcus at a neutral location, a coffee shop in downtown Charleston, and had given him a chance to truly understand why his comment about her father had been so devastating, why it represented a larger pattern of disrespect that she could no longer ignore. Marcus had apparently apologized, but Claire described it as hollow, more concerned with the consequences he was facing than with genuine remorse for the hurt he'd caused. What had sealed Claire's decision, Eleanor told me, was when Marcus suggested that Walter could make things right by posting something on social media explaining that it was all a misunderstanding, that Marcus had actually been talking about someone else. The audacity of asking the man he'd insulted to lie publicly to salvage his reputation showed Claire exactly who her husband really was, someone more concerned with appearances than with integrity. She'd walked out of that coffee shop with absolute clarity about her path forward, and while it terrified her, Being a single mother and starting over at 32, she knew it was the right choice. Walter, she reported, had told her he'd support whatever decision she made, that he wanted her happiness above all else. The divorce proceedings revealed financial information that shocked everyone, including Claire. Marcus, it turned out, had been living well beyond their means, financing his expensive lifestyle with credit and risky investments that hadn't paid off. The BMW was leased, not owned, and he'd been making minimum payments on credit cards with balances totaling over $100,000. The house Claire thought they owned free and clear, thanks to Walter's generous down payment, actually had a second mortgage Marcus had taken out without telling her to cover investment losses. Claire was devastated by the deception, and I watched her age years in the span of weeks, the carefree woman of the birthday party replaced by someone harder and more wary. Meanwhile, Marcus's professional situation deteriorated further. He was officially let go from his firm in early November. The termination dressed up as mutual agreement to part ways, but everyone knew the truth. His reputation in Charleston's financial community was damaged beyond repair, at least in the short term, and I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that he'd been interviewing for positions in Atlanta and Charlotte. Hoping to start fresh somewhere, his name hadn't been dragged through social media. The schadenfreude in some of the neighborhood comments bothered me, even as I recognized I'd been the catalyst for much of Marcus's downfall. There's a difference between accountability and destruction, and I wasn't sure anymore which side of that line I'd fallen on. Walter remained the steady center through all of this chaos, and I found myself spending more time in conversation with him as the weeks passed. He'd come over to help me with some minor repairs on my fence, refusing to accept payment and working with the careful precision of someone who took pride in doing things right. We talked about his years in construction, about the buildings he'd helped create that still stood throughout Charleston, about the satisfaction of creating something solid and lasting. He spoke about Claire with such tenderness, about teaching her to ride a bike and sitting through endless ballet recitals, about walking her down the aisle to marry Marcus with hope that had now been revealed as misplaced. One afternoon in mid-November, with Thanksgiving approaching and the air finally turning truly cool, Walter asked me directly about the social media post. He'd known all along it was me, he said, because Eleanor had told him. And he wanted me to know that while he appreciated the defense, he was also worried about me, about whether I'd face any backlash for speaking out. His concern for me, even in the midst of his own family crisis, was so characteristic of his generous spirit that I felt my eyes water. I told him honestly that I'd do it again, that his kindness deserved to be recognized and Marcus's cruelty deserved to be exposed. And he gripped my hand with his calloused one and said simply, "Thank you." In that moment, I felt the weight of my choice settle into something I could live with. The neighborhood itself had shifted in subtle ways since September. People were more thoughtful about how they treated each other, more aware of the hidden generosities and quiet struggles happening behind closed doors. Mrs. Patterson organized a meal train for the Sullivans, not because they needed it, but because she wanted to show support, and nearly every family on our street participated. The Kims invited Walter and Eleanor to Thanksgiving dinner when they heard Claire would be spending it with her mother-in-law's family so Tommy could see Marcus. There was a renewed sense of community, built on the foundation of recognizing and valuing the good people among us, and I felt proud to have played a part in that, even if my methods had been controversial. Thanksgiving week arrived with unseasonably warm weather, the kind that makes South Carolinians joke about having Christmas barbecues. The Sullivan house had taken on a peaceful quality, the earlier tension replaced by a kind of settled determination. Claire had found a job working remotely for a marketing firm, the flexibility allowing her to be present for Tommy while maintaining her independence. She'd lost weight from the stress, her face more angular than before, but there was a strength in her bearing that hadn't been there when she was married. I watched her and Tommy playing basketball in the driveway one afternoon, her laughter genuine and unforced, and thought about how sometimes losing everything that's wrong makes room for everything that's right. Marcus had moved to Atlanta, Eleanor told me, having found a position with a smaller investment firm where his Charleston reputation hadn't preceded him. The divorce was proceeding, and there were negotiations over custody arrangements for Tommy, with Marcus pushing for more time than Claire felt comfortable with, given his pattern of putting work before family. The boy seemed to be adjusting well, considering the upheaval, and I'd noticed Walter taking on an even more active grandfather role, walking Tommy to the school bus each morning and being there when he got home each afternoon. The routine and stability seemed to anchor them all, a reminder that life continues and children need consistency above all else. My social media post had largely faded from active discussion, though it occasionally resurfaced when similar situations arose in other neighborhoods. Used as an example of calling out bad behavior, I'd received both praise and criticism in private messages. Some people thanking me for standing up for the vulnerable, while others accused me of ruining a man's life over a single comment. I'd stopped responding to either type of message. Having said what I needed to say, and having no desire to become some kind of social justice spokesperson, the experience had taught me about the power and danger of public shaming. And while I still believed Marcus needed to face consequences, I wasn't entirely comfortable with how thoroughly his life had been dismantled. Walter and I had developed an easy friendship through those autumn months, and he'd become a regular visitor to my porch for afternoon coffee. We talked about everything and nothing, from politics to gardening to the changes we'd seen in Charleston over our decades here. He spoke occasionally about his marriage to Eleanor, about the challenges of maintaining connection over 46 years, about learning to support your partner through difficult times. He never directly mentioned Marcus or the situation, but I sensed that he was processing something deeper. Questions about what kind of man inspires respect versus contempt, about how we measure a life's value. His reflections had a philosophical quality that suggested he'd always been a thoughtful person, just one who'd never been given much platform to share those thoughts. The week before Thanksgiving, I received an unexpected visit from Marcus's mother, Patricia Henderson. She was a well-dressed woman in her 60s, her gray hair perfectly styled and her manner initially cold as she stood on my doorstep. She'd driven from Columbia specifically to confront me about destroying her son's life, and I invited her inside, feeling I owed her at least the courtesy of hearing her out. Over tea in my living room, Patricia defended Marcus, explaining his stress level at work, his pressure to provide for his family, the mistakes in judgment that everyone makes. Her pain as a mother protecting her child was evident, and I listened without interruption, understanding that sometimes people need to be heard even if they're wrong. When Patricia finished, I calmly explained what I'd witnessed. The cruelty in Marcus's tone and words, the disrespect he'd shown to a man who'd given so much to his family. I told her about Walter's generosity, about the party he'd funded, about the years of support he'd provided Claire that Marcus had apparently viewed as worthless because it came from someone he considered beneath him. Patricia's face crumbled as I spoke, and I realized that Marcus had never told his mother the full truth, had painted himself as a victim of an unfair social media attack, rather than someone facing consequences for his own actions. The conversation lasted 2 hours, and by the end, Patricia left with a very different understanding of the situation, her anger at me replaced by disappointment in her son. December brought the holiday season in full force to Charleston, with Christmas decorations appearing on houses and the neighborhood association organizing the annual holiday lights competition. The Sullivan house remained simply decorated, a wreath on the door and white lights along the porch railing. But there was a warmth emanating from it that the more elaborate displays elsewhere couldn't match. Claire had begun attending a support group for women going through divorce, and Eleanor reported that it was helping her daughter process the betrayal and disappointment, providing a community of people who understood the complicated grief of a marriage ending. Tommy had started seeing a child therapist, ensuring that the upheaval in his life didn't leave lasting damage. Walter's health became a concern in early December, when he had what turned out to be a mild heart attack while raking leaves in his front yard. I was actually there when it happened, chatting with him from my porch, and I saw him pause, press his hand to his chest, and sink slowly to the ground. I called 911 while running to his side, and Eleanor appeared moments later, her face white with fear. The ambulance arrived within 8 minutes, and Walter was rushed to the hospital where tests revealed 2 partially blocked arteries requiring immediate intervention. The incident shook the entire neighborhood, and I spent that evening with Eleanor and Claire in the hospital waiting room, all of us confronting the reality that Walter's sturdy presence wasn't eternal. That time and stress take their toll. The cardiac procedure went well, and Walter was home within a week. Equipped with new medications and strict instructions about diet and stress management, the incident had a profound effect on the family dynamics, with Claire becoming fiercely protective of her father's rest and recovery time, and Eleanor hovering constantly despite Walter's good-natured protests that he was fine. Marcus, to his credit, sent flowers and a card expressing concern, though he didn't attempt to visit, respecting the boundaries that had been established. Tommy, frightened by his grandfather's hospitalization, became Velcro attached to Walter once he was home, wanting to sleep on a cot in his grandparents' room to ensure the older man was okay. The neighborhood response to Walter's health scare was overwhelming in the best way. People I'd barely spoken to over the years stopped by with healthy meals, offers to help with yard work, and genuine expressions of concern. The Kims installed a Ring doorbell on the Sullivan house so Walter and Eleanor could screen visitors without having to answer the door. And Mrs. Patterson organized a rotating schedule of neighbors who'd check in daily to ensure everything was okay. The community that had rallied around the idea of defending Walter from disrespect now rallied around the reality of supporting his recovery, and I felt a renewed appreciation for the neighborhood I'd called home for 2 decades. During Walter's recovery, I spent considerable time reflecting on the chain of events my single social media post had set in motion. A marriage had ended, a career had been destroyed, a family had been fractured, and a good man had suffered a heart attack. That stress had likely contributed to. I didn't regret exposing Marcus's cruelty, but I couldn't help wondering if there had been a better way. A more private path to accountability that wouldn't have involved public humiliation and such far-reaching consequences. Eleanor, during one of our conversations, told me she believed everything had unfolded as it needed to. That the truth about Marcus would have emerged eventually and that it was better. Claire knew now rather than after more years had been wasted. I appreciated her reassurance but still carried the weight of knowing my action had been the catalyst. As Christmas approached, Claire made a decision that surprised everyone. She filed paperwork to legally change her and Tommy's last names back to Sullivan. She explained to her parents that she wanted to fully embrace her identity as their daughter, to honor the family that had supported her unconditionally, and to give Tommy a stronger connection to his grandfather during this fragile time in Walter's recovery. The gesture moved Walter to tears, though he tried to hide it. And Eleanor told me later that it was the first time in years she'd seen her husband allow himself to be that vulnerable. The name change felt symbolic of something larger, a reclaiming of values and identity that Marcus's influence had obscured. The holiday lights competition brought unexpected attention to the Sullivan house when someone anonymously nominated them for the Spirit of Christmas Award, a special category that recognized not decorations, but the values of generosity and community that the holiday represented. The neighborhood association, after reading the nomination letter that detailed Walter's quiet kindness and the family's grace through difficult times, unanimously awarded them the honor. On a chilly December evening, neighbors gathered in the Sullivan yard while the association president presented Walter with a plaque, and I watched this humble man who'd never sought recognition stand surrounded by genuine appreciation, his family beside him and his community affirming his worth in a way that no party ever could. The new year arrived with the kind of optimism that feels almost mandatory in January, everyone making resolutions and declarations about fresh starts. For the Sullivan family, 2024 held genuine promise of renewal, rather than just hopeful thinking. Walter's recovery was progressing well, his cardiac tests showing improvement, and he'd even returned to light gardening work despite Eleanor's protests. Claire's divorce was nearly finalized, the settlement more favorable than expected after Marcus's financial deceptions were fully revealed during discovery. Tommy was thriving in school, his teacher reporting that while he'd gone through a rough patch in the fall, he now seemed more secure and happy than ever before. Marcus had become engaged to someone in Atlanta, news that reached Charleston through the inevitable social media connections that persist even after relationships end. Eleanor had shown me the Facebook post. The two of them at some trendy restaurant, Marcus's smile as wide and practiced as ever. And we'd both felt a wave of pity for the woman who apparently didn't know what she was getting into. Claire's reaction, when she heard, was telling. Instead of anger or jealousy, she felt only relief that Marcus had moved on, that he was someone else's problem now, and that feeling confirmed she'd made absolutely the right decision in leaving. The emotional detachment was complete, the divorce not just legal but spiritual. I received a surprising letter in mid-January from Patricia Henderson, Marcus's mother, who I'd met during her confrontation visit in November. The letter was thoughtful and apologetic, thanking me for our conversation and explaining that she'd since had several difficult discussions with her son about his behavior and values. Patricia wrote that Marcus had been raised better than he'd behaved, that somewhere along his path to financial success he'd lost sight of what actually mattered, and that she hoped the consequences he'd faced would ultimately make him a better person. She enclosed a separate note to pass along to Walter, which I did, and while he never shared its contents with me, I saw him tucked it carefully into his wallet, suggesting it meant something to him. The neighborhood settled into its winter rhythm, quieter and more inward-focused than the social months of summer and fall, but the connections forged during the autumn's drama persisted, and I noticed people being more intentional about checking on each other, more willing to have deeper conversations instead of just polite surface exchanges. The Kims started hosting monthly potluck dinners for the street, and the Sullivans rarely missed one, with Walter becoming something of a storytelling treasure. His construction tales and Charleston history captivating younger residents who'd never thought to ask about the neighborhood's past. There was a sense that we'd been through something together and it had made us more genuinely neighborly. My own life had been enriched by the whole experience in ways I hadn't anticipated. Walter's friendship had become important to me, filling a space I hadn't realized was empty since my husband died 8 years earlier. I'd also discovered a passion for community advocacy, and I'd gotten involved with the local senior center, organizing programs to honor and utilize the skills of retired residents. The library where I'd worked for 30 years had asked me to help develop an oral history project, recording the stories of longtime Charleston residents, and Walter would be one of my first interviews. I felt more purposeful and connected than I had in years, as if standing up for someone had awakened something dormant in me. Claire had started dating someone, a fact I learned when I saw an unfamiliar car in the Sullivan driveway on a Saturday afternoon and later spotted Claire walking with a man around the neighborhood, both of them pushing Tommy on his bike. Eleanor was cautiously optimistic, reporting that this man, David, was a high school English teacher, divorced with a daughter Tommy's age, and seemed genuinely kind and unpretentious. It was early days, Eleanor emphasized, but she was encouraged by Claire's willingness to be open to new possibilities. Walter had met David and given his approval, which Eleanor noted was no small thing, as her husband had developed a much more protective streak toward their daughter since the Marcus situation. As winter deepened and Charleston experienced the handful of truly cold days we get each year, I found myself thinking about how one moment, one overheard comment, had rippled outward to touch so many lives. Marcus's words had been cruel and careless, but they'd also been revealing, pulling back a curtain on his character that needed to be exposed. My decision to speak publicly about what I'd witnessed had been controversial, but it had sparked something larger than accountability for one person. It had created a conversation about respect, gratitude, and how we value the people around us. I still struggled sometimes with the magnitude of the consequences, but I'd come to accept that speaking truth, even uncomfortable truth, is sometimes necessary for change. February brought Valentine's Day and an unexpected development when Walter and Eleanor celebrated their 47th wedding anniversary with a renewal of vows ceremony in their backyard. It was Claire's idea, a way to honor her parents' enduring partnership and to create a joyful family memory after the difficult months they'd endured. The ceremony was small and intimate, just close family and a handful of neighbors, including myself, but it was more moving than many elaborate weddings I'd attended. Walter and Eleanor stood beneath the oak tree where their daughter had played as a child and their grandson played now, and they promised again to love and support each other through whatever remained of their journey together. I was honored to be invited and even more honored when Claire asked me to read a poem during the ceremony. I chose Mary Oliver's When Death Comes, which might seem an odd choice for a celebration, but its message about living fully and noticing the beauty in ordinary. Things felt perfect for a couple who'd built their life on simple, solid values. Walter cried during the reading, and so did I, and afterward he hugged me tightly and whispered that having me as a neighbor had been one of life's unexpected gifts. Eleanor had made me promise to catch the bouquet, which I did amid much laughter, and the afternoon felt like a reclamation of joy after months of stress and sadness. Marcus did not attend Tommy's 8th birthday party in March, a decision that was his own according to the custody agreement, which said he could attend but wasn't required to. Claire had invited him, wanting Tommy to have both parents there if possible. But Marcus claimed work obligations prevented him from traveling from Atlanta. Tommy handled the absence well, or at least appeared to, and the party in the Sullivan backyard was cheerful and uncomplicated. Themed around dinosaurs per the birthday boy's request, Walter had built an elaborate dinosaur dig sandbox where kids could excavate painted rocks labeled as fossils. And watching him interact with Tommy and his friends, patient and engaged and genuinely interested in their excitement, I thought about how the most important legacies we leave aren't financial, but relational. David, Claire's new partner, had become a regular presence at the Sullivan house, and I'd gotten to know him through several porch conversations. He was genuinely thoughtful, the kind of person who asked follow-up questions and remembered details from previous conversations, and his daughter Sophie got along wonderfully with Tommy. Eleanor confided that she was trying not to get her hopes up too much, but she appreciated how David treated Claire with respect and consideration, asking rather than assuming, including rather than controlling. The contrast with Marcus was stark, and it made Eleanor realize how much her daughter had been diminishing herself to accommodate her ex-husband's ego, something she hadn't fully recognized while it was happening. The spring brought garden projects that Walter and I tackled together, his extensive construction knowledge proving invaluable for building raised beds and a small pergola in my backyard. Working alongside him, I was struck again by his competence and patience, the way he measured twice and cut once, the way he explained what he was doing and why, treating me as a collaborator rather than a helper. We talked while we worked about everything under the sun, and he shared more about his years in construction, the pride he'd taken in his work and the frustration of often being invisible, the way people notice buildings but not the men who built them. His reflections had a poignancy knowing that Marcus had embodied that very dismissal, valuing what Walter had built but not the builder. The anniversary of the party approached in late September, and with it came a kind of reflective mood for everyone involved. A full year had passed since that evening when Marcus's words had set everything in motion, and so much had changed. Claire was genuinely happy in a way Eleanor said she hadn't been during her marriage. Tommy was well-adjusted and thriving. Walter had recovered his health and his sense of being valued, and even Eleanor seemed lighter, less burdened by the tension that had apparently characterized their family gatherings when Marcus was present. The marriage ending had been painful, but everyone agreed it had also been necessary, that sometimes destruction is required before reconstruction can begin. October arrived with perfect fall weather, cool mornings and warm afternoons, and Claire announced that she and David were moving in together. They'd found a house just 3 streets over, close enough that Tommy could easily walk to his grandparents, but far enough to establish their own household. Eleanor had mixed feelings, happy for Claire but already missing the daily presence of her daughter and grandson. And Walter simply seemed pleased that Claire was building something new with someone who appreciated her. The house needed work, and David had jokingly asked Walter if he'd supervise some renovations, which turned into an actual plan with Walter serving as consultant and occasional helper on the projects David tackled on weekends. Marcus had been fired from his Atlanta job, news that came through the grapevine when someone from Charleston ran into a former colleague of his at a conference. Apparently, he'd repeated some of his old patterns, alienating clients with his arrogance and failing to maintain the relationships necessary for success in wealth management. His engagement had also ended, reportedly after his fiancée discovered his financial situation was far shakier than he'd represented. I felt a complicated mix of emotions at this news, certainly no satisfaction in his continued downfall, but also no particular sympathy given that he seemed incapable or unwilling to learn from his mistakes. Some people, I'd come to realize, would rather blame circumstances than examine their own behavior. I'd been asked to speak at a local community center about the power and responsibility of social media. Using my experience with the post about Marcus as a case study, I'd initially declined, uncomfortable with being held up as any kind of example. But Walter had encouraged me to accept, saying that the conversation about online accountability needed voices willing to grapple with complexity rather than just taking sides. So I'd agreed. And the talk I gave was honest about both my motivations and my doubts, exploring the question of when calling out bad behavior crosses into cruelty, when public shaming serves justice, and when it becomes revenge. The discussion afterward was thoughtful, and several people thanked me for not simplifying a situation that was genuinely complicated. Claire's legal name change became official in November, and she and Tommy celebrated by having a small family dinner where Walter gave a toast that left everyone in tears. He spoke about names and legacies, about how the Sullivan name represented values he'd tried to live up to, hard work and integrity and putting family first, and how proud he was that Claire wanted to reclaim that identity and share it with Tommy. He acknowledged that the past year had been difficult, but said that it had also clarified what mattered. That you learn who people really are, not when things are easy, but when they're hard. Claire later told me it was the most her father had ever said at one time, and that every word had been perfect. Thanksgiving was at the Sullivan house again. But this year's gathering bore no resemblance to the elaborate party that had started everything. It was just family and a few close neighbors. A potluck meal where everyone contributed something, eaten around a table that had been extended to its maximum length and supplemented with a folding card table. David and Sophie were there, and the ease with which the two families blended suggested that this configuration might become permanent. Tommy said grace, a simple child's prayer thanking God for his family and his grandpa being healthy. And I saw Walter grip Eleanor's hand tightly, both of them overwhelmed with gratitude for the moment. The meal was noisy and chaotic and absolutely perfect. Everything a family gathering should be. I'd started writing down some of what had happened over the past year, initially just for myself to process the experience. But the writing had taken on a life of its own and become something more structured. Walter had read some of it and encouraged me to finish it, suggesting that the story might resonate with others navigating the complicated territory between loyalty and truth-telling, between protecting people we care about and holding them accountable. I decided to turn it into a small book, not for publication necessarily, but as a record of what had happened and what I'd learned. The process of writing had helped me clarify my own thinking, and I'd come to peace with my choices, imperfect as they'd been. December brought the second holiday season since the party, and the neighborhood Christmas lights competition felt different this year, less competitive and more genuinely festive. The Sullivan house was lit up more elaborately than the previous year, with Claire and David spending a weekend installing lights and decorations while Tommy and Sophie supervised from the yard. Walter had built a wooden nativity scene for the front lawn, hand-carving each figure during the fall, and it became the centerpiece of their display. Neighbors stopped by constantly to admire his craftsmanship, and I watched him receive the compliments with his characteristic humility, deflecting praise to the joy he'd gotten from making something with his hands. Patricia Henderson, Marcus's mother, surprised everyone by visiting Charleston and asking to meet with Claire. The meeting, held at a coffee shop with Eleanor present for support, was Patricia's attempt to apologize for her son's behavior and to establish some kind of relationship with Tommy, her only grandchild. Claire was wary but willing to listen, and according to Eleanor's report, Patricia had been genuine in her regret about not recognizing Marcus's character flaws earlier, about enabling behavior she should have confronted. The two women agreed that Tommy deserved to know his paternal grandmother, and they worked out a schedule of supervised visits, Patricia coming to Charleston once a month to spend time with her grandson. It was a surprising development, but a healthy one, extending grace without requiring reconciliation with Marcus himself. I received a Facebook message from Marcus himself in mid-December, lengthy and rambling, equal parts apology and justification. He wrote that he'd been wrong to mock Walter, that stress and alcohol had loosened his tongue but didn't excuse his words, and that he understood why Claire had left him. But he also blamed me for taking a private comment and making it public, for destroying his career and reputation over what he characterized as one mistake. He asked me to post a retraction or clarification to help repair the damage I'd caused. I read the message several times considering how to respond, and ultimately decided on honesty rather than either aggression or appeasement. I wrote back that I didn't regret exposing cruelty, but that I hoped he'd learned from the experience, and that his path forward lay in changing his behavior, not in asking others to minimize what he'd done. Walter's oral history interview for the library project took place over several sessions in January, and I was privileged to hear him tell his life story in detail. From his childhood in rural South Carolina to his decades in construction to his years of retirement, the stories were rich with detail and humor, and Walter's natural storytelling ability made the recordings engaging and authentic. He talked about building Charleston's skyline, about the satisfaction of seeing cranes and steel become buildings where people worked and lived, about the crew camaraderie and the exhaustion of manual labor. He spoke about Eleanor and Claire with such tenderness, about being a husband and father while working 60-hour weeks, about the sacrifices and joys of family life. The recordings would become part of Charleston's permanent archive, Walter's voice and story preserved for future generations. Claire and David got engaged on Valentine's Day, a simple proposal during a beach walk that Tommy and Sophie had helped plan, both children presenting Claire with a ring box while David got down on one knee. The wedding was planned for June, a small ceremony in the Sullivan backyard, under the oak tree that had witnessed so much family history. Eleanor was thrilled, grateful that her daughter had found someone who truly appreciated her, and Walter had given his blessing after a long conversation with David about commitment and partnership and showing up when things get hard. The engagement felt like a natural progression rather than a dramatic leap, and I thought about how the best relationships develop from friendship and respect rather than just passion and attraction. Marcus had started seeing the child therapist with Tommy during his Atlanta visits, a requirement Claire had insisted on before allowing unsupervised time. The therapist reported that Marcus was beginning to understand how his behavior had affected his son, how Tommy had absorbed the tension in his parents' marriage, and the implicit message that success meant money and status rather than character and kindness. Whether Marcus could truly change remained to be seen, but the fact that he was willing to engage in therapy rather than just fighting the requirement suggested some capacity for growth. Tommy came back from visits saying his dad asked better questions now, seemed more interested in what Tommy thought rather than just what he'd achieved. And while Claire remained skeptical, she wanted to believe her ex-husband could become a better father. Spring arrived with its usual glory, Charleston blooming in azaleas and dogwoods, and the wedding preparations kicked into high gear. Claire had asked me to do a reading at the ceremony. Mary Oliver again, this time The Journey, about the moment you finally realize you have to save your own life. It felt perfect for someone who'd walked away from a destructive marriage and rebuilt herself with courage and intention. Walter was building an arbor for the ceremony, another woodworking project that gave him joy and purpose, and Tommy and Sophie were practicing their roles as ring bearer and flower girl with adorable seriousness. The wedding would be small, maybe 40 people, but it felt significant in a way elaborate weddings often don't. A true celebration of commitment rather than performance. The neighborhood had continued its transformation into a more genuinely connected community, and several of us had started a monthly book club that met on rotating porches in good weather. Walter had joined, surprising everyone by being an insightful reader and discusser. his practical wisdom illuminating texts in unexpected ways. We'd just finished discussing To Kill a Mockingbird, and Walter's comments about Atticus Finch and the quiet courage of standing up for what's right when everyone else is silent had resonated deeply with me. I'd thought about my social media post about speaking up when witnessing injustice, and while I still had complicated feelings about the consequences, I'd never regretted the decision to speak. Some silences, I'd learned, are complicit. Marcus had moved back to South Carolina, though not to Charleston, taking a job in Greenville with a financial planning firm that apparently didn't do thorough background checks or didn't care about social media history. He was seeing Tommy more regularly, and the supervised visits had transitioned to unsupervised time after several months of successful therapy sessions. Claire remained cautious, but she acknowledged that Marcus seemed to be making genuine effort to be a better father, even if she doubted he'd ever really understand why his values had been so destructive. Patricia had become a regular presence at the Sullivan house, her relationship with her grandson growing stronger, and Eleanor had developed an unlikely friendship with her. Two mothers who'd both been disappointed by Marcus in different ways, finding common ground in their love for Tommy. The wedding in early June was perfect in every way that mattered. The weather cooperated, warm but not hot, with a gentle breeze that rustled the leaves of the oak tree. Claire looked radiant in a simple cream dress, and David's face when he saw her walking down the makeshift aisle on Walter's arm was everything you'd hope for. Absolute wonder and commitment. Tommy and Sophie performed their duties flawlessly, and my reading went well despite my voice catching with emotion. Walter's toast at the small reception was brief and heartfelt, welcoming David to the family and expressing gratitude for a man who treated his daughter with the respect and love she deserved. There wasn't a dry eye among the 40 guests, and the celebration that followed was joyful and uncomplicated, exactly what the couple had wanted. I reflected that evening, sitting on my porch and watching the Sullivan house lit up with celebration, about the journey we'd all taken since that September night nearly 2 years earlier. Marcus's cruel comment had been the catalyst for so much change. The end of a marriage, but also liberation for Claire. Pain for Walter, but also validation. Disruption for Tommy, but ultimately a healthier family structure. Chaos for the neighborhood, but also deeper connection. The easy narrative would be that I'd been the hero, exposing a villain and rescuing a victim. But reality was far more complicated than that. I'd been a neighbor who'd witnessed something wrong and spoken up, and the ripples from that action had touched many lives in ways both positive and negative. The only clear truth was that silence would have allowed the disrespect to continue unchallenged, and that seemed intolerable. Walter's health remained stable, his cardiac issues managed with medication and lifestyle changes. Though we all knew that at 73, time was precious. He'd become philosophical about mortality, telling me during one of our porch conversations that he felt at peace with his life, that he'd built things that mattered, both physical structures and family relationships, and that he was grateful for every day he got to see his grandson grow. His contentment wasn't resignation but genuine satisfaction, the kind that comes from living according to your values and being recognized for it. The Spirit of Christmas plaque hung in his workshop, but I knew the award he valued most was Claire, reclaiming his name, declaring publicly that she was proud to be identified as his daughter. As summer settled over Charleston with its oppressive heat and humidity, the neighborhood fell into its seasonal rhythm of early morning activities and evening porch sitting. The middle of the day too hot for anything but air conditioning and iced tea. The newlyweds had returned from a honeymoon in the mountains and settled into their house, the renovations complete and the blended family finding its groove. Tommy and Sophie had become inseparable, and watching them ride bikes around the neighborhood reminded me that children are remarkably resilient when given stable, loving adults to guide them. Claire had been promoted at her marketing job, her creativity and dedication finally recognized and rewarded, and Eleanor beamed with pride every time she mentioned her daughter's success. I'd finished the manuscript about everything that had happened, and after much deliberation, I'd decided to pursue publication, changing names and details to protect privacy but keeping the essential truth intact. The story of how one overheard comment had cascaded into a family's transformation and a community's reflection felt important to share. Not as judgment, but as exploration of the complicated ethics of speaking up. Walter had read the final draft and given his blessing, even suggesting that I use his real name because he had nothing to hide. Though I'd declined, wanting to focus attention on the questions raised rather than the specific people involved. The book was scheduled for release in the fall, and I had no idea how it would be received, but I knew I'd told the truth as I'd lived it. Marcus had reached out to Walter directly in August, asking to meet for coffee when he was in Charleston visiting Tommy. Walter had agreed, much to Eleanor's surprise and concern, and they'd met at a downtown cafe where Marcus had apparently offered a genuine apology for his disrespect and arrogance. Walter reported that Marcus seemed different, humbled by his losses and working to rebuild not just his career but his character. Whether that transformation would stick remained to be seen, but Walter appreciated the effort. The two men didn't become friends, but they achieved a kind of peace. The acknowledgement that they'd both been harmed by Marcus's words and that moving forward required letting go of anger. Walter's capacity for forgiveness impressed me deeply, though he made clear that forgiveness didn't mean forgetting, and that trust once broken took years to rebuild. The second anniversary of the party, as we'd all come to call it, arrived in late September, and the Sullivan family marked it with a quiet dinner, just the four of them, Claire and David and Eleanor and Walter. They'd decided to create a new tradition, an annual gathering to celebrate not the party itself, but the transformation that had followed it. The painful breaking down of what was false and the building up of what was true. Tommy was thriving in 3rd grade. Sophie had joined their family officially through David's joint custody arrangement, and the blended household had found its rhythm. Patricia visited monthly, maintaining her relationship with Tommy while respecting the boundaries around not pressuring Claire to reconcile with Marcus. The family structure was unconventional but healthy, proof that families are defined by love and commitment, rather than legal documents or traditional configurations. I sat on my porch that September evening, watching the lights come on in houses up and down the street, each one containing its own stories of struggle and triumph, heartbreak and healing. Walter walked by on his evening constitutional, a habit his doctor had insisted on for cardiac health, and he stopped to chat. Leaning against my porch railing in the golden hour light, we talked about the changes of the past 2 years, the unexpected ways that crisis can become catalyst, the importance of speaking truth even when it's uncomfortable. He thanked me again for defending him, and I thanked him for being someone worth defending. And we both acknowledged that the story wasn't really about him or me, but about the larger questions of respect and dignity and how we value human beings. As darkness fell and Walter continued his walk, I thought about the lessons I'd learned through this experience. That cruelty exposed has power to change systems, but that power must be wielded carefully. That consequences for bad behavior are necessary, but we should take no joy in others' suffering, even when deserved. That families are resilient but require work and honest communication to heal from wounds. That communities are strengthened when members stand up for each other and built on the foundation of recognizing the worth in every person. That redemption is possible but not guaranteed and requires genuine change rather than just better PR. And perhaps, most importantly, that the seemingly small choice to speak up or stay silent can ripple outward in ways we cannot predict or control, making it essential to act from principle rather than impulse, from love rather than revenge. The neighborhood had become more than just a collection of houses on a street. It had become a genuine community, connected by shared values and mutual care. The Sullivans remained at its heart, Walter's quiet dignity and Eleanor's gracious hospitality providing an anchor for the rest of us. Claire and David added young family energy, and their children reminded us all of what we were building toward. A world where kindness mattered more than status, where character counted more than wealth, where people were valued for who they were rather than what they owned. Marcus's absence from the neighborhood was not celebrated but not mourned either. He'd removed himself through his own choices, and we'd moved on, taking from his negative example lessons about who we wanted to be and how we wanted to treat each other, creating something better from the wreckage of his cruelty. And me, I remained the neighbor who watched and listened, who noticed the stories unfolding around me and sometimes chose to tell them. I'd learned that observation without action is complicity, but that action without wisdom is dangerous. I'd discovered that my voice, raised at the right moment, could make a difference, but that the difference wasn't always what I intended or expected. I'd found friendship and purpose in my retirement years, and I'd come to appreciate that the everyday dramas of ordinary people contain as much meaning and significance as any epic tale. The story that had started with cruelty overheard in a doorway had become a story about transformation and redemption, about the power of community and the necessity of standing up for what's right, about the complicated, messy, beautiful work of being human and choosing every day to be better than we were the day before.